Hi everyone, I wanted to give you a quick overview over the uterine and ovarian cycles and how they're controlled by the anterior pituitary hormones. So in the female, the ovarian and uterine cycles are controlled by the anterior pituitary. And we know that the anterior pituitary secretes the gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH, and their target tissue is the ovary. Well, when FSH and LH reach the ovary, they cause follicular development. And those follicles release the ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And it's estrogen and progesterone that control the uterus and the uterine cycle. So, to kind of recap, the ant pit controls follicular development. Follicular development determines the hormones that are produced. And those ovarian hormones control what's going on in the uterus, in the uterine cycle. So for these female cycles, we typically say that they last 28 days. And it's not exactly 28 days in every female. It could be a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, but we kind of pick 28 as the average. So what's happening in the ovary is we have multiple follicles that are waiting to become developed. And those follicles specifically are the primordial follicles. So in the primordial follicle, we have a little primary oocyte. And then we have follicular cells around it that kind of look squamous in shape because they're inactive and they're not yet secreting hormone. Well, what has to happen in order for those primordial follicles to begin developing is the anterior pituitary has a surge in FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So what FSH causes to happen is it stimulates or begins the follicular development. Which means that FSH, once it's released and travels to the ovary, causes the primordial follicle to develop into a primary follicle. And what we see under the microscope is we still have that primary oocyte on the inside, but those follicular cells are beginning to develop and beginning to divide. And as they do, they begin to develop release little bits of estrogen. As the primary follicle continues, it develops into a secondary follicle, which has more and more cells, follicular cells, dividing. And eventually what happens is they begin producing more and more estrogen. Well, after the production of the secondary follicle, develops into a very large tertiary or Graafian follicle. And eventually the Graafian follicle will become so large that the egg cell, the secondary oocyte, along with the cells around it, the corona radiata, will be released from the ovary during ovulation. So it's FSH that puts this chain of events into motion. Well, the follicular cells are producing more and more estrogen as we approach ovulation. So when we look at the level of hormone like estrogen being produced by the ovary, we see that it's very low at the beginning of the ovarian cycle. But then as those follicular cells divide and as they start releasing more and more estrogen, those estrogen levels begin to steadily increase. Until right before ovulation, which is approximately day 14, give or take, we see a huge surge in estrogen levels. So like we said, at day 14 we have ovulation. And the period of time before that, where we're developing the follicle, is called the follicular phase. So again, just to recap this phase, the anterior pituitary releases FSH, which begins follicular development. That primordial follicle develops into a primary, then a secondary, then a Graafian follicle, which is producing more and more estrogen right up until ovulation. Well, after ovulation, the egg, the secondary oocyte, leaves, and what's left over are these follicular cells, and they form the corpus luteum. And the job of the corpus luteum is to stick around and continue producing hormones. And one of the hormones that's continuously made by the corpus luteum is progesterone. So what we see after ovulation is we have this increase in estrogen, and that estrogen stays pretty elevated right up until the end of the ovarian cycle. Progesterone, on the other hand, starts out relatively low at the beginning of the ovarian cycle, and it also gradually increases up until ovulation. But we see the biggest increase in progesterone during the period of time when the corpus luteum is active. So looking back at what's happening in our anterior pituitary is we have FSH, but remember we also have another gonadotropic hormone, LH. So what's happening in the anterior pituitary is LH stays relatively low up until ovulation. Notice we said that those follicular cells are producing more and more estrogen, and that makes luteinizing hormone more likely to be produced. So right around day 14, there's a large spike in LH. And we also have a little blip of FSH being produced. But it's really this large spike in luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation. Now you'll notice that we have some similar terminology: luteinizing hormone, corpus luteum, and then the last part of the ovarian cycle, the luteal phase. All of that refers to the formation of the corpus luteum. So again, right around day 14, we have a surge in luteinizing hormone, which causes ovulation. Those follicular cells that used to be around the tertiary follicle stick around and form into the corpus luteum, which produces progesterone during the luteal phase. So that leads us to the uterus. So remember from lab, the uterus has two main layers that we look at. It's got a perimetrium around the outside. It's got a myometrium made of smooth muscle. But then it has an inner layer, the endometrium. So what happens is during the first part of the uterine cycle, right up until day 5 to 7-ish, we have the menstrual phase. And during the menstrual phase, what's happening is the endometrium, which I'll draw here in purple, begins to shed, and as time goes on, it becomes thinner and thinner, until all that's left is mostly the stratum basalis of the endometrium. Well, what's causing that menstrual phase to happen is the drop in estrogen and progesterone at the end of the ovarian cycle. So the drop in estrogen and progesterone from the previous ovarian cycle causes menstruation. So next up, we have the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. And what's happening in the proliferative phase is that the stratum functionalis is beginning to regrow, and it becomes thicker and thicker. So imagine proliferative means that those cells and the endometrium are proliferating, so it's getting thicker overall. If we look up at our ovarian cycle, the thing that's causing that to happen is the increase in estrogen. So the thickening of the endometrium is caused by estrogen. Some places you may also see that estrogen causes the endometrium to regrow. So when we say thickens, we're referring to that stratum functionalis regrowing. Now, during the last part of the uterine cycle, we have the secretory phase. And during the secretory phase, we're taking that endometrium that's become thicker, and it's becoming even more engorged with blood. So if we think about what's going on under the microscope, in the proliferative phase, we have these nice, round, oval-shaped endometrial glands. And in the secretory phase, they become very large and kind of jagged looking. And this whole endometrium is going to engorge with blood. If we look at the hormones from the ovary that are being released during the secretory phase, notice that progesterone is much higher. So during the proliferative phase, we had estrogen thickening the endometrium. In the secretory phase, it causes it to thicken even more, but also engorge with blood. So to recap, the anterior pituitary hormones, FSH and LH, control follicular development in the ovary. The hormones that are produced by the follicles control the uterus and the uterine cycle. So when the anterior pituitary releases FSH, it begins follicular development, and the follicles begin to make more and more estrogen. The estrogen that's produced by the follicles causes thickening of the endometrium. Right around day 14, ovulation, there's an increase in estrogen, which causes a surge in luteinizing hormone that triggers ovulation to occur. That causes the leftover follicular cells to develop into the corpus luteum, which releases progesterone, and that progesterone causes the endometrium to engorge with blood. At the end of the ovarian cycle, when there's a drop in estrogen and progesterone, that's what causes menstruation to occur, where the stratum functionalis of the endometrium is lost.